Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions that archaeologists who work in the Middle East make to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark from La Sierra University, direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. My co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, is, as I'm liking to say, on assignment. He is in the Middle East, probably preparing for more episodes of Excavating the Bible. Our regular guest and conversation partner, Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity at La Sierra University, and is now chair of our Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology as well. Kent, we have moved through a good deal of the Bible, and we are now at what I think is just a wonderfully profound but complicated book, the book of Job.
It is, isn't it? One can puzzle. Yeah. I remember reading that book again and again and trying to understand the different voices of Job's friends, of Job, God's voice, the sort of the envelope at the beginning and the end. And I think one can keep going back to it for new insight, new inspiration, time and time again.
The conversations back and forth, the dialogues. Somebody has suggested, who is an expert in oral transmission, in oral communication theory, suggested that Job might be best understood if it were a kind of a performance. And that's why we have all of this repetition, because if it's oral, you hear it again, and there's this echo effect and this resonance that keeps coming back and back again. And if it were a performance, we would probably process it quite a bit differently if we were sitting in an audience, in an ancient audience or even a modern one. So that might help us actually as we think about...
With an attention span that's a little longer than today's television.
That's right. That's right.
Attention spans.
That's true. Before we talk about Job in particular, let's think about what most scholars call wisdom literature, or the wisdom tradition. Talk to us about that.
Well, it seems to be a different perspective on life. We've been spending a lot of time with the prophets, with certainly the histories of ancient Israel. We call that the Deuteronomic history because the kings are all evaluated on their behavior. And the belief that God blesses those who follow him and brings curses. Think of the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy. And the wisdom literature seems to point us in a different direction. It's sort of a critique. It says, does this always happen? Is it always the case? And so it causes us, I think, to reflect on some of our assumptions.
I think that's what you've just said is true biblically and in the ancient Near East, where you've got this kind of critique of the traditional. In Job and Ecclesiastes, we have it quite strongly. In a book like Proverbs, another wisdom book, that's more in line with the kind of prevailing theology that obedience leads to success and so on, and disobedience to the opposite. So we have a bit of both in the Old Testament. But what I wanted to ask is this unusual, or is this part of an ancient Near Eastern phenomenon?
Right. When you start looking at the literature from Egypt or from Mesopotamia, these ideas, sort of the critique and the questioning of justice in the world, go clear back. I mean, early second millennium in Egypt, we have a number of texts. It's the height, really, of classical Egyptian literature. We call it the Middle Kingdom. And in Mesopotamia, too, we have much from the late second millennium, early first millennium, that provide parallels to similar types of questioning and reflection that we have in the wisdom literature of the Bible.
In fact, we will be bringing into our discussions on this program for Job now and for Ecclesiastes later, as well as Proverbs, this literature and what kinds of parallels we can find. And then ask the question, okay, is this part of the air that these guilds, these wisdom, these sages breathe? Is this part of something that was everywhere, or is this something specialized? I mean, we only have a few books in the Bible that are wisdom literature. So I think it's going to be fun to do some comparing here.
It will.
Now, the notion of wisdom literature, most people would argue that there are probably a couple of what, maybe basic purposes. We've talked about the differences kind of between Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes. Proverbs seems to be what? Is it more pragmatic? Is it more practical?
It is. It's the application of sometimes witty observations about life. But again, the wisdom is not, it's not in the promise of the saying, it's rather in the application at the correct time and place.
Right. And then the other kind would be, would we call it speculative or philosophical, like we have in Job and Ecclesiastes?
Trying to understand, again, propose answers or at least point out the lack of answers in some cases.
Right. Well, we want to look at the book itself in a minute, but first of all, we have some artifacts in front of us, and so let's talk about them. Tell us how these might apply to our discussions on the book of Job.
Well, they illustrate very everyday types of pottery, likely from the time of Job, and certainly the functions that would have been employed with ceramics and artifacts around Job's life.
Would that be true in a tent dwelling?
Yes,
setting?
all of these artifacts would be very comfortable in a sort of a semi-nomadic, what we might think of Bedouin and how they live. In a tent, usually set up at one place for weeks or even months at a time, but still movable, it's mobile. Pot sherds. I mean, these are everywhere. People drop a pot, they don't bother to pick up the pieces and throw them very far. They just kick them off to the side. So pot sherds are ubiquitous. And we know in the story of Job, he uses the pot sherds to sort of clean his boils, his sores. I mean, they use them for many things. They would chip them down into spindle whorls. You could write out letters on them. It's just your everyday available material.
And they're, as you say, they're everywhere. They are ubiquitous. And so it would not take Job a long time to find a few.
Right, he could just reach out and nearby.
And so what, liquids?
Well,
I see a lamp. What sorts of uses would these?
Right, a basic lamp, again, providing some light at times of necessity. A bowl, probably you think of Job sustaining himself with some kind of porridge. Wouldn't have been up for a lot of hard bread probably, but a little bit of porridge. So a bowl like this would have been what it might have been served in. We have pouring vessels. Again, think of water for Job. Oil, probably dressing the wounds with olive oil. Smaller vessels, again, you might put in other kinds of ointment, which might have been medicinal or considered to be medicinal, and you could pour them out with a spout like this.
So they would work in a tent. They would work in a house, a rural setting, general, but not elite. Not elite.
We know Job was wealthy. He lost much of his excess wealth, or the large numbers of flocks and herds. And, so he may have had some elite items, but by and large, this is probably quite representative of what we would find in a typical tent at that time.
Okay, well, let's take a look at an outline of the book itself.
All right.
And that might help us kind of piece together this book. We haven't gotten into the archaeology of it yet, but we will. But the book itself. This is only the first slide of the outline. And Kent, it looks like there's something that is prose at the beginning, and as we'll see in the next slide in a minute, prose at the end. What sort of thing has that led scholars to think?
Well, it's an interesting envelope to the story. Most of the book of Job are these dialogues which are in poetry. And you already mentioned that one can think of a setting where one would listen to, would hear the reading of these. So lots of repetition. The prose, the beginning and the end, are very straightforward and really frames it in an interesting theological explanation. When I read the book of Job, I see perhaps three theodicies, justifications of God, we call them.
Right.
Why do bad things happen? And I don't know when we want to talk about those, but the epilogue, along with the prologue, gives us one overarching theodicy. It's sort of the great controversy scenario.
Right.
cosmic in its scope.
And there's reward. There's something that comes back.
There
okay,
is.
it's replacement children, but still, it is children. So I don't think they asked about the replacement part.
You know, I read this story in the bedtime version to my 8-year-old son, and it was hard for him.
Yeah.
And he could understand God bringing back the sheep or blessing with more and the camels, but the children are irreplaceable, and to just assume that more children later make up for them is a little bit hard.
Okay, so that's the overarching one, and that's all prose. The rest of it is all poetry. So what do we have in that central part?
Well, we have alternating cycles, and in a cycle, or a sequence of cycles, and in a cycle we usually have Job speaking and then a response or an address, at least from the friends, the 3 main friends. We get a 4th one at the end.
Right.
And these friends, although they have somewhat different perspectives, all make arguments based on, well, it's the theological approach we're familiar with from Deuteronomy and its application in Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, and Samuel too, where the promises are fulfilled, blessings are fulfilled in the case of obedience, but the curses, you think of the calling out of the blessings and the curses, Mount Ebal and Gerizim. But yeah, the curses, what shall we say, eventuate if people don't follow God. So it's, again, blessings for right doing, bad things if you don't.
Now, does this play into one of your 3 theodicies?
It does. It does.
And then that would be the friends? Are you tying it to the friends?
I'm tying it to the friends, and really Job's own assumptions. He speaks out or proclaims his innocence, but it's up against sort of that background assumption that he should be blessed because he was righteous.
Right.
He's like, God, if you only look, what have I done wrong?
Exactly. Now the major, would you say that the major theodicy, or at least maybe one of the more profound ones, is at the end of the divine speeches? Is that where you would put the 3rd?
Well, it would be. God's speech is, people have read it and wondered where it's going. Where is the real answer here? And in a sense, there isn't a clear explanation or justification. But what it does is removes Job from the center. I mean, way out from the center. Discussions of cosmology, of meteorology, of the weather, especially of the animal kingdom, of the animal life, zoology, yeah. And at the end of this, Job is feeling very small and insignificant. And somehow that leaves him, or provides him the room, I think, to have this personal transition maybe, and he has such grace towards his friends at the end.
It's profound, those divine speeches. I mean, were you there, Job, when the sons of God, we're going to come back to them in the book of Psalms, when they shouted together at the creation of the world? Were you there? Have you led Leviathan out with a leash? Have you taken?
Well, and that's interesting. Symbols of chaos. So God has taken ownership of symbols of chaos in the universe, which Job has just experienced.
It's kind of just out there, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't end. This is the reason you are suffering, Job. It doesn't even get at that. But something about God is pretty clear at the end. Well, at least it's profound. It jumps out at you, leaves you some space to think.
Job, no doubt, was still wondering. We don't know if he was aware of the prologue and epilogue, but Job was no doubt wondering, and the listeners of the story would be wondering. And they wouldn't have a decisive answer, but I think it would still shift their perspectives.
Right. So the book itself has the prose beginning and end, and then poetry in the middle. Some people have suggested those come actually from separate times. And that, I've heard the argument both ways, but the one that makes more sense to me is that the prose, prologue and epilogue are standard kind of patriarchal kind of narrative for nomadic tribes. And that seems to me to be the older one. And then wedged in is this profound poetry. Is that how you?
Well, you know, it is interesting in the story of in Kings or in Samuel maybe, where David does a census of conducts a census of the people, and he's condemned for it, and God brings the punishment, or excuse me, yeah, God brings the punishment. But when Chronicles retells it,
this is a century or two later.
It's a century or two later. It is Satan who tempts David, whereas the earlier account said God tempted David. So yeah, there are new understandings and different ways of framing sort of the cosmic dimensions of stories.
And even the word Hasatan is really kind of lower case letters, the adversary.
Adversary, accuser,
and we have
troubler.
human adversaries. We actually have an angel adversary in the story of Balaam. The messenger from God is the Satan. So it's not Satan full-blown, writ large.
Right, it's a verb, and it means to oppose.
And so maybe we ought to broaden our perspective on what that's about, too. So, well, the last half of the book, we see the dialogue and the interchange, actually cycles of dialogue. And then hear a hymn, and then Job's defense. We're going to come back to that, especially chapter 31. And then this other, is he ever called a friend, Elihu? He ever?
Well, we don't know if he quite ranked within Job's inner circle or not.
Right.
Yeah, right.
He thought he should.
He certainly moves in at that point where the others fall silent.
And then the divine speeches, and finally the epilogue, which wraps it, which brings it, the envelope or some other bookending the book itself. Well, some issues that we have to think about. We talked a little bit about these wisdom traditions in the ancient Near East and literature outside the Bible. We'll actually be looking at some of that. Cosmopolitan, this flavor, this seems to be a flavor that's bigger and wider than Judah or Israel. Am I right in reading it that way?
Oh, yes, I think very much. They're a part of this literary world. And while Judah, the Israelites, frequently have insights and their own perspectives, it's very much a part of the literary world within which they exist. So we find parallels to some extent from Egypt and from Mesopotamia. Those are regions where the literature was preserved. Right. No doubt there were other literatures that simply haven't survived to this day.
Does this help as we think about context for books like Job? Some people might worry that we really don't have anything distinct here, or separate, or inspired. I've always felt that it's inspired, but it would be familiar to people because it's part of their world. Is that a way to read it that might be helpful?
And it's a way that they're dealing with life and all the things that life brings, and the framework within which they try to understand that. So I think all of the cultures found that significant.
Right, struggled to do that. And that's what we have here. So we've talked about Egypt and Mesopotamia. We'll come back to that. Suffering of the righteous, you mentioned. I'm not going to say a lot about the life after death, but Job does talk as if the tomb, or Sheol, is kind of the end of the story, but everybody had grave goods.
Yeah,
so how do we understand that?
Well, there was a recent inscription, a stela has a picture as well as an inscription found actually up in Turkey at Zingerli, and it's the inscription of a person called Katamua. And in this inscription, he refers to his soul residing in the stela upon when he would die. And it appears that it's important that goods and food be brought to him to remember his soul, his existence. So in some sense, he lives on in some shady or semi-conscious way, perhaps, in the stela, which is interesting. So we know that, I think that shifts a lot of understanding about why there would be grave goods in all of these tombs throughout Canaan and ancient Israel. And so Job never is clear. He says, you know, if a tree is cut down, it can sprout back, but modern translations at least have a question mark, but can a man live again? And so there's that question mark.
Then you go to the end of chapter 14, and it just seems to me that it just gets down to, okay, this is kind of the end. My relatives come, but there's no communication. So that's an interesting puzzlement in the biblical text. But then we have the archaeological grave goods. So that's something we keep thinking about. Excellent, excellent. Artifacts.
Well, everybody likes to identify Leviathan.
Right.
There have been numerous attempts to connect it with various extant animals or extinct animals.
That's right. There is this Sumerian, not a sea monster, but a land monster, a seven-headed critter. What would this have communicated?
Well, certainly fearsomeness. And by the way, Leviathan is simply the parallel of Lotan in the Ugaritic cycle. So we know that there was a word out there that meant something to not only the author of Job, or the Bible, but to surrounding cultures. So you can try to think about that in sort of the animal kingdom or mythological context.
Yes. Right.
And a seven-headed beast, of course, there's something special about seven. And
everywhere.
It's symbolic probably of, you know, of overwhelming a fierceness or appetites or something.
Inscriptions. We have several that we want to look at. A couple of them Egyptian, one Babylonian, another one that's Mesopotamian. I'm not sure if it was Babylonian or before. It might
Sumerian,
be.
maybe.
Yes, perhaps Sumerian. And then Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story. So we'll take a look at some of these. A suggestion, well, this is a relief, evidently. And the people who labeled it called it the Babylonian pessimists. I'm not sure. Maybe it should just be the Babylonian sages.
Maybe the sages.
Like that, but in any case. So, the Book of the Dead, Declarations of Innocence. So we've got a couple of slides from this. Kent, read this for us, and then we'll look at the parallel in Job.
So Egyptian. We're in Egypt now. When you reach the Hall of Two Truths, confess your sins and say, I have not sinned against my neighbors. I have not mistreated cattle. I have not committed perjury in the temple. I have not sought restricted knowledge. I have not done evil. I have not repeatedly made slaves work overtime. I have not starved the hungry. I have not caused others to weep. I have done nothing evil. I have not robbed. I have not coveted. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not cut the grain ration. I have not cheated. I have not stolen a sacrifice of the divine assembly.
So this is a declaration of innocence, what, before the judgment bar kind of thing? Is that what's
right? This the Egyptian Book of the Dead has all sorts of incantations and sort of a path to follow when you reach the other side. And so this person is instructed to make these statements at the judgment bar.
Let's see if there's a parallel in Job. Actually, the whole of chapter 31, virtually the whole of chapter 31. It's framed a little bit differently, but if I've walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance and let God know my integrity. If I have withheld anything from the poor, that the poor have desired, or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, etc. So here is a series of things, and it's a long series, rather like the Egyptian one. So maybe this was a common, literary device?
Probably.
Think about it. Sufferer. Okay, Kent. This is from the beginning of the second millennium BC, also in Egypt.
Yeah, which is the high point of Egyptian literature. They tried to write in that style 500, 1,000 years later. Right. Hear me out, my soul. My life now is more than I can bear. Even you, my own soul, cannot understand me. My life now is more terrible than anyone can imagine. I am alone. So come with me, my soul, to the grave. Be my companion in death. If you cannot take away the misery of living, do not withhold the mercy of dying from me. Death stands before me today, like health to the sick, like freedom to the prisoner. Death stands before me today, like the smell of myrrh, like a canopy on a windy day. Death stands before me today, like the perfume of the lotus, like sitting in the land of drunkenness.
So, not unlike Job. If you really read Job and the text and what it says, this is not too much.
Right. I mean, it's calling out for an end to the misery.
Right. Okay, a different text, the Babylonian dialogue of pessimism. An interesting sort of discussion between a slave and the master.
Yes.
And people have wondered where it came from. In many ways, it's really rather fun to think about. It has 10 sections to it and then a conclusion. We're not going to look at all of those, but here's one. Go ahead.
Slave, listen to me. Here I am, master, here I am. Fetch me the chariot and hitch it up. I want to drive to the palace. Drive, master, drive. It will be to your advantage. When he will see you, the king will give you honors. Oh, well, slave, I will not drive to the palace. Do not drive, master. Do not drive. When he will see you, the king may send you God knows where. He may make you take a route that you do not know. He will make you suffer agony day and night.
So that fun sort of thing. We'll not read all of these, but the next one is about going on a hunt. Oh yes, go on a hunt. And then the master says, no, I will not. And then the slave says, okay, don't do that. And here are the reasons. Setting up a home, making love is an interesting one. I mean, there are several of these. But then the last one is probably the most profound. Slave, listen to me. Here I am, master, here I am. What then is good? To have my neck and yours broken? Or to be thrown into the river, is that good? Who is so tall as to ascend to heaven? Who is so broad as to encompass the entire world? Oh well, slave, I'll kill you and send you first. Yes, but my master would certainly not survive for 3 days. So what is the answer then? Well, we don't have it. We have the dimensions to it. And I think that's true of a lot of this philosophical or theoretical or speculative wisdom. Kind of leaves
It's interesting. He has an
thoughts.
idea, and then he thinks about all that could go wrong. And he thinks he'll send his slave first to the afterworld.
Okay, Babylonian. Now this one has alternating voices. So if you'll read the sufferer part, I will read the friend. So this is like Job with the friends.
The sufferer says, "Come, my wise friend, let me speak candidly with you. I am without resources. I am lost in the depths of despair. When I was a child, fate took my father from me. The mother who bore me went to the land of no return. My parents left me an orphan."
The friend. Your story is too sad, my friend. Do not continue to dwell on these evils. You have blinded yourself to common sense. Frowns have scarred your face. Parents die, they cross the river. If anyone could choose, who would not choose to be rich?
The sufferer. "Listen, my friend, to my words. Hear my irrefutable arguments. People praise the powerful who kill, while they persecute the powerless who are innocent. People listen to the wicked who despise their divine patrons, while they ignore the honest who obey them. People fill the storehouses of the wicked with gold, while they steal a beggar's bowl."
And the friend. Again, this back and forth, just like the book of Job. When Enlil, ruler of the divine assembly, we will come to this term again when we talk about the Psalms. Created humans, when Ea, the glorious, pinched them from the clay, interesting. When Mami, the mother and queen, shaped them, the divine assembly endowed humans with twisted speech. I don't know if that's a helpful thing to know or not. People treat the poor like thieves, slander them like criminals. People terrorize the poor to death, snuff out their lives like a flame. So this back and forth, is that too part of the tradition of wisdom in the ancient Near East?
To be a way to explore the possibilities of reality.
And see, I would say that that's what presses us to another level of context that actually can help us understand the Job dialogues even better. Does that make sense?
That does.
Okay, well, thank you.
I'll have to reread it.
Well, that's right, and thank you for agreeing. That's a nice thing to agree on. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope to have provided something for you to think about and to enhance your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.